Who is John Forbes Nash Jr. and why has his life impacted so much? Is there any movie inspired by him? These questions have been heard more repeatedly since the making of Beautiful Minds, a movie that has completely changed the world's perspective on schizophrenia, an illness that is known and one of the hardest and most difficult to cope with.
John Forbes Nash's life begins in Bluefield Sanatorium. He was born the 13th of June, 1923. He was surrounded by a loving and attentive family. However, he was a lonely and introverted child. His father, named John Forbes, had a pretty stable job as an electrical engineer.
He was a good father, really, someone worthy of respect and appreciation.
Margaret Virginia Martin, his mother, was a former school teacher.
Well, I had a strong feeling of influence. He had a good education. Worked for a while as a school teacher, which is a popular employment of young women.
And he also had a younger sister who was born 2 years later, called Marta.
His interest in science started developing at a young age. As we have previously mentioned, her mom was a former teacher, which led him and his sister to have great access to books and encyclopedias. During the movie, we aren't able to see any part of his early life. Instead, it starts during his first studies.
From watching the film, it is hard to be situated as a viewer, given the complexity of his illness. However, we're able to see his studies beginning in Princeton, and later on in 1951, he goes to work in the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, also called the MIT, to elaborate his most famous theory. The opening sequence of the movie is well elaborated. These first scenes already depict his illness, but this movie is made for the viewer to slowly suspect that something doesn't add up. We get to see his imaginary best friend, and he even thought he had a parallel job that consisted of preparing a conspiracy against the US, so he wrote personal letters to the US government. John tried to convince the government that they had to use a completely different method of encryption, and he even suggested one. Comparing this story to the actual real-life one, it was completely invented, just like the real Dr. Nash said.
A life takes actually many years or years. A movie lasts like at most 2 or 3 hours. And so how can you depict a life in that length of time?
According to his wife, Alicia Nash, he developed the idea that all men who wore red ties were included in a communist conspiracy against him. To warn others about the conspiracy, Nash sent letters to embassies in Washington.
I have previously mentioned Alicia Nash, his wife, but how did they really met? The story was really well produced in the film, as well as being very similar as how it actually happened. Alicia Nash entered the MIT as a physics major at the same time Professor Nash was teaching in the mathematics department. They meet up as professor and students. Alicia's first thoughts was, I walked into the classroom and I thought he was very nice looking. He was like a fairy-haired boy of the math department.
So they both got married, just after a painful separation John experienced. During these years, when he was 30 years old, he began experiencing severe paranoia and delusions. Meanwhile, Alicia was pregnant with their first and only child. Due to the seriousness of John's illness, he was sent to an institution near Boston. Many relatives decided to go with him, including his wife, Alicia. When he was discharged, his condition worsened. Given the hard times, she divorced him, but surprisingly, 38 years later, they both remarried. The movie describes this last part as both staying divorced, but Alicia offering him her home to ensure that he was safe during his treatment.
Now moving on to the main topic of the movie, John's illness, it's schizophrenia. We've mentioned that some of the things that appear in the movie are made up, and this is because its schizophrenia causes hallucinations. We do have to mention that the film shows a distorted view on the disease, because although every case of schizophrenia is different, in the majority of cases the patient does not physically see anything, but instead they hear voices. When they do see things, they are fantastic and cartoonish. Even when they're persons, they are very distorted, not lifelike as they appear in the movie. This was the case of Dr. Nash in real life. He didn't see people, but he did have a lot of irrational fears and heard voices. He didn't notice his illness until he was 30 years old, but when he did, his life changed completely.
He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and was put into psychiatric facility for compulsory treatment. This was electroshock, a treatment that we don't use anymore, but was the only option back at the time. Up to this, real life and movie are very similar. However, in reality, John didn't stop taking his pills when he was tired of their secondary effects. As we see in the film, he continued taking medication, which was evolved a lot. So by the time he passed, the pills he was taking had less secondary effects and he didn't have to do electroshock anymore.
So now that we've mentioned treatment, because of the film, we know that secondary effects of the pills were very strong. They limited Dr. Nash's life and damaged his relationships. But how does a family of someone with schizophrenia go through the situation? Well, in the movie, we see that Alicia stays with John the whole time. She cares about him and tries to help him differentiate what's real and what's not. Of course, it is very hard for her because the man she fell for is gone. Her routine is absolutely abandoned and she has to take care of him the whole time. Also, she has to stop working because her husband can't, and they move houses. So basically, she carries the whole family while still being a strong support for John and a mom. However, she also fears him at times. For example, when he tries to attack her because hallucinations have taken control of his mind, so she doesn't really know what to do. Having someone like Alicia or just a structured family that supports you throughout the whole process is very important for mental diseases patients, and it has been proven over the last 20 years that family helps reduce symptoms and stabilize the patient.
Now, let's mention what's probably the biggest professional achievement in Dr. Nash's career. During the last scenes of the film, it is shown the ceremony in which John Nash was awarded with the Nobel Prize in Economics, thanks to his studies on the theory of games and differential equations, to which he dedicated his whole life. The representation in the movie is very similar to the event that happened in real life, as John Nash, after receiving the award, gives a speech in which he mainly thanks his wife and tells her that she is and will be the reason why he was still living. The studies and theories of John Nash have not only been a great discovery in the area of economics, but have afterwards served to describe fundamental laws of physics, chemistry, and biology.